All right. Hey guys, for this lecture today, we're mostly going to be talking about the first term, first 4 years of Washington's presidency. Remember in our last lecture, we've made the Constitution, the government, the highest supreme law of the United States, and it set up our national government with its three separate but equal branches, each with a system to check and balance the other branch so that no one branch could become too powerful. Enlightenment ideas like those woven into it. Well, in 1789, in March, because that was the original inauguration date, Washington is sworn in at Federal Hall in New York City, which was the first national capital, because at this time, Washington, D.C., named after George Washington, was not yet built. It wasn't even planned yet. We're going to talk about that today. I remember that Washington sets a lot of examples for what it means to be president because that role was being defined by him as the first of its kind. What to call him, Mr. President versus Your Majesty, Your Excellency, that was a big debate. And also how he would lead in this role that seems so monumentous to have to enforce and execute all the laws of the nation. How does a single man do that? Washington adopts a very militaristic strategy because remember, he is the general. He was our commander in chief of the Continental Army. And so he uses those military generalship practices to basically inform how he's going to approach being president of this country. And he sets up a bunch of like aide de camps, advisors. He would have a war council, like in the war, to advise him before any battle on strategy and logistics and all these things. So similarly, Washington sets up the first cabinet. It's not officially mentioned in the Constitution, but because Washington sets up the cabinet, all presidents following Washington will also set up a cabinet with these official advisors helping them to enforce the laws of the country. And remember, he's got Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Originally, it was supposed to be John Jay. John Jay wanted to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Jefferson was the next pick. He was in France as our ambassador under the Articles to Paris, but he comes back, and so Thomas Jefferson will be in that Secretary of State position. The Secretary of War was Washington's good old friend, Henry Knox. Remember, one of his right-hand men during the Revolution who had helped to solve a lot of the logistic problems, like with the cannons across the Delaware River and stuff. The Secretary of the Treasury was initially going to be somebody else. He backed out and recommended Hamilton, who Washington intimately knew from the war, being his aide de camp, kind of like one of his surrogate sons, because remember, Washington could never have children of his own. Him and Martha, sadly, were not able to have their own children. So Washington had the whole slew of young men that he fostered and mentored and became like a father figure to. And probably at the top of that list was Alexander Hamilton, who himself had been an orphan. So Alexander Hamilton, very brilliant. He'd be the first one to tell you how smart he was. He will be our first Treasury Secretary. And then the Attorney General, the Governor of Virginia, Edmund Randolph, the one who read the Virginia Plan at the Constitutional Convention for James Madison. Now, not mentioned on here, but also incredibly important to Washington's cabinet in a advisory and kind of hatchet man role was James Madison. So just because he's not like an official cabinet secretary, please be aware James Madison was doing a lot of Washington's work, doing a lot of things for Washington, especially in this first term anyway. Let's start off talking about Native American issues. Basically, under the new Constitution, Native American tribes would be seen as separate nations. And it would be the national government that would be in charge of negotiating with them. So let's turn our focus to the American Southeast today and the state of Georgia. They've been causing lots of problems, not showing up for meetings, being obstinate, and fighting a lot of wars against natives for these Western land claims of theirs. Well, the state of Georgia at this time claimed all the land that was to the east of the Mississippi River. Here, let me get my little flashy pointer. Hopefully you can see this better now. So here's the Mississippi River on this map. All the land right here that makes up today the states of like Alabama and Mississippi. Here's Mississippi, here's Alabama. This was all claimed by the state of Georgia at this time. Even some parts of like Tennessee were part of this. Now down here, this was West Florida. This was still at this time under the control of the Spanish here on the Gulf Coast. And then this part, East Florida, had been ceded to the British, remember, after the French and Indian War. This is not part of Spain at this time. That's a little different story. And so what the state of Georgia was doing was basically in the Yazoo land deal, they had sold off like millions of acres of land here in Mississippi and Alabama. Georgia had, they said, a claim to it. They sold it off to private speculators, these four major companies of speculators who basically bribed the Georgia Assembly and the Georgia governor to give them this land deal. They bought it for just $500,000. All of this land. It was crazy, crazy good deal. And it was super shady. And then they started selling off smaller bits of this land to like private families and businesses and other like private treaties, private individuals. Well, they can't do that because this land was under the control of like various Native American groups. In fact, in 1790, George Washington met with the Creek Nation and their representative leader, Alexander McGillivray. Alexander McGillivray, by the way, not a typical Creek. His mother had been a Creek Native American woman. His father was a Scotsman immigrant to the United States. And McGillivray was a businessman, a plantation slave owner, not what you would think of typically as a Native American. But because he knew English, he also had been trained in the law. He was a very valuable representative for the Creek Nation. And of course, he also had his own personal interest in, getting special deals for himself and all of this. But basically, he and a contingent of Creek warriors, they show up for the treaty negotiations in New York to meet with George Washington, who actually personally took an interest in this. Washington normally would leave a lot of the grunt work to his subordinates. But Washington actually met with McGillivray, and they hashed out this treaty, the Treaty of New York in 1790, that made sure that the Creek lands would be protected by the federal government. See, even though in hindsight, looking back, we know that the course of American history is going to heavily feature manifest destiny, the belief that Americans had a God-given right to extend from sea to shining sea. And, heaven or hell, we're going to do it. Basically laying waste to all the Native Americans who already were living on the land. But at this time, there was still the belief from like George Washington and other important founding fathers like Henry Knox, his Secretary of War, and even Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Ironically, if you know about the Louisiana Purchase, later he'll do as president. But at this time, even Thomas Jefferson, they had this belief that America could function simultaneously, like at the same time, with Native Americans, that we could negotiate a peace, that we could each have our own lands, like each have our cake and eat it too, I guess. They truly believe this. And what they hoped would eventually happen is that, because you're seeing the population trends where the states and the United States is growing steadily in population, while at the same time Native American populations are dwindling. So what these founding fathers like Washington, Jefferson, and Henry Knox hoped would happen is that Native American society would assimilate, that they would start to cultivate their land as Europeans did, that they would slowly integrate into our society. Remember, that's called assimilation, when you start to fit in like that. And then eventually they would just be absorbed into the United States. So they're not like envisioning a slaughter, a wholesale slaughter and demise of Native people. They want to eventually incorporate them and have this be a slow transition. And negotiating this treaty in New York was one way to kind of make this slow transition possible for the Native Americans, give them time, give them their land. So the Native Americans are dealing with the federal government. The federal government seems to be saying all the right things, but then you have the state of Georgia selling off all this land and basically nullifying the treaty. Eventually, in Fletcher versus Peck, a Supreme Court case in 1810, the Supreme Court will say that Georgia never had the authority to overturn this law. Like 2 years later, after the land sale to the speculators, the Georgia legislature says that the land sales were null and void. The Supreme Court in this case, whoops, hold on, there we go. The Supreme Court in this case says state of Georgia doesn't have the authority to do that. It shows the authority of the national government over the state government when it came to land sales like that. But that's 1810. In the meanwhile, under Washington's presidency here in the 1790s, Washington is horrified that basically his treaty has been upended so thoroughly by Georgia and these speculators and land companies. And in the meanwhile, you know, there's a lot of innocent parties who had bought land from the speculators who didn't know about the shady agreements, who now are going and settling this land and being asked to return it, and they say no. And then a lot of more settlers, they start going across the mountains and start settling this land. And there's really nothing that Washington or his administration, that's his people, his presidency, can do to stop them. And if you think about it, this is kind of somewhat ironic, because this is the exact same problem that the British were facing way back with the Proclamation Line in 1763, right? Remember, after the French and Indian War, King George III, he had the proclamation there across the Appalachian Mountains. That line said that no English settlers, no colonists shall pass it, and that all the lands to the west of the Appalachians would be reserved for Native Americans. Washington is trying to kind of do the same thing, but again, you can't stop the settlers unless you literally send a military down there. And how are you going to provision a armed, you know, enforcement guard for like perpetuity, forever, to stop settlers from going west? You can't afford that. This nascent, you know, early fledgling American government can't reasonably expected to try to stop settlement west of the Appalachians. So Washington, facing the exact same problem the British did, is helpless and extremely frustrated. And of course, the Creek Nation was as well. So that is the Yazoo land scandal. This land was called the Yazoo lands for the river there. Another thing happening with Native Americans that is of note under Washington's presidency was the Northwest Indian Wars. Now, there's going to be many, many Indian Wars. This is kind of the first in American history, because now we are actually the United States of America. And this is taking place in the Ohio and Indiana country, Illinois country. This is the same land that had been fought over that we talked about since the French and Indian War. And the problem here that's happening is that even though the Treaty of Paris in 1783, this is the one that ended the American Revolution, even though America won and was supposed to be given all the lands that were east of the Mississippi River, Britain didn't exactly just up and leave all of the forts that they'd had in the Great Lakes area. They still were manning many of those forts, like in what today would be Michigan, and even lower. And the British were also allying with Native Americans, even like sending British Canadian forces to assist them, even providing them with weapons, ammunitions, and supplies. So this is not just the Native Americans who are going to be in this area causing problems for American settlement, but also the British still lingering on in forts in this area, the old Ohio country and the Great Lakes region. And And what's happened is that, remember, under the Articles of Confederation, under the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s, they had passed the Northwest Ordinance, like 1787. It officially went into effect, and that's provided a way to make new states, to carve out specifically anywhere from 3 to 5 new states out of this Northwest territory, what would eventually become the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and even parts of Minnesota later on. And that meant that we would start to have settlements. Colonists, or this case Americans, American settlers, would go into the region and begin to set it up and populate it. But of course, the Native Americans, just because the Revolutionary War was over and the Americans had beat the British, Native Americans aren't just going to roll over and say, oh yeah, we're defeated, please take our land. So they're going to resist this settlement under the Northwest Ordinance. And they actually form a Western Confederation, it was called, of many different Native American tribes, some of whom had been, they used to reside far on the East Coast, and now they've been pushed to this, like the Delaware were part of this, Lenape. You also had the Mingos, the Shawnee, the Huron, the Ottawas, the Miami, the Wyandots, and even some Mohawk that were part of this confederation of Native Americans. There were many different chieftains from each of the tribes that participated. Some of the main ones you need to know about were Little Turtle. There's a statue of him there at Detroit. And you also had Blue Jackets. He was another one of the chieftains that took part in this first of our Indian Wars. The American military at this time was really, really not, what's the word? It didn't exist. We didn't yet have it. We now had a stronger government thanks to the Constitution and the ability to raise a military, but it hadn't quite yet been formed. And some of the early battles in this Northwest Indian War had some very, very bad casualties for the American forces that were out there. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and some of their losses were the worst and still are the worst in American military history. Like there were over 1,000 that were killed in several skirmishes with these natives of this new confederation. And so finally, what George Washington does is he's going to appoint one of his top Continental Army generals, Anthony Wayne, who had the nickname Mad Anthony Wayne because he was like full on hardcore go-getter, use whatever tactics necessary in your face, let's get him guys, kind of guy, very passionate. So Mad Anthony Wayne is basically detailed with creating the first national military. It's going to be called the Legion of the United States, kind of a cool name. And this Legion of the United States is trained by Anthony Wayne. They're going to be much more professional military than the little militias we kind of had garrisoning forts out there. And they are going to confront this Indian Confederation, who at the time was being led by Blue Jacket. Little Turtle had actually said that Anthony Wayne was no joke. He called him a black snake that will never stop, that was relentless. And Little Turtle told the rest of the Confederation, he advised them, let's make peace with this guy. Let's not try to fight him. Blue Jacket called Little Turtle a coward and said that they would be able to defeat Wayne just the same as they defeated the others. And he's the one that's leading. Little Turtle shuts up and says, all right, but you're the one that's making the calls. I've already spoken my piece. And the two sides confront each other in what is today Ohio, I think near Toledo, at this place that's going to be called the Battle of the Fallen Timbers, because there were some fallen trees there that had actually been downed by a tornado that had passed through the area earlier. And this battle takes place. It lasts for less than an hour, thanks to the cannons that Wayne had and overall military discipline, plus targeting, actually, here's some irony, targeting some Native American chieftains and causing a lot more chaos among their side than what they would normally have. That's ironic, right? Because that was a Native American tactic that we've seen before them use against the Europeans. The Battle of the Fallen Timbers is quickly over, and the new American Legion, the Legion of the United States, has won. Very decisive victory. And it'll still be a few years as the tribes, they go from place to place. The British Canadians who are actually there supporting the Native Americans, several of them die. When they retreat up to Fort Detroit, which was still controlled by the British had closed their doors of the fort and refused to allow the Native Americans refuge. And so that was a big betrayal on the part of the natives' ally, Britain, because Britain is like technically helping them, but also technically not wanting to start a direct war with America, who had just defeated them. It's a very fluid, complicated situation, but the natives were betrayed basically on all sides. And eventually they sue for peace. The official native term for agreeing to peace is like burying the hatchet. That's where that comes from. And so that's where we get eventually the Treaty of Grenville in early 1790s. And what the Treaty of Grenville did was officially allowed for the Northwest Ordinance to take place, for settlement to actually happen unhindered by Native American attacks. And so now the Ohio country is up for grabs. Settlement can officially begin. Settlers don't have to worry about being totally annihilated by Native Americans. That's the Treaty of Grenville. Now let's turn our focus back to New York and Washington's cabinet and his government and how he is leading the nation at this time. Remember, he's got these advisors who he's letting delegate a lot of his authority to. And the first thing we got to focus on is the debts that have accrued from the American Revolution. Every state had some debt. Some states had more debt than others. And the national government was supposed to figure out some way to deal with all of this debt from the war. How do we pay it off? The House of Representatives and Congress has the power to tax. How are we going to do this? This had never been done before. The government's brand new. They have to figure all of this out. And of course, Washington tasks his right-hand man, his former aide-de-camp, the new Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, with figuring out a plan. Now, Hamilton did not have a ton of experience in finances. I think he had previously, as a New York representative, helped to set up the Bank of New York. But he's a very smart guy, and like I said, he'd be the first to tell anybody how smart he was, and he's going to be coming up with a financial plan. It has 3, maybe 4 parts to it, with an added bonus 5th part that will be negotiated that you need to know about, Hamilton's financial plan. Now, before we get into it, though, I can't remember how much I've spoken about Hamilton's background. I just want to give a little bit of it because we listen to so many of the songs from the musical Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was born in the 1750s, maybe 1755, maybe 1757. There's some debate actually on when he was born. In the West Indies, on a tiny little spit of land called Nevis. Nevis is next to St. Kitts, right on the edge of the Western Antilles, and there were British colonies at this time when he was born. So he's from the Caribbean. And his mother was of French Huguenot descent with some British ancestry. So she was of somewhat mixed heritage. Officially on the census record, she was listed as white, but there's been some debate. A Huguenot, by the way, was like a French Protestant. His father was a Scotsman who had actually descended from a very, very wealthy Scottish clan from like Airsdale or somewhere. Now, they were not married, so technically young Alexander Hamilton and his older brother, they were bastards, which is not just a slang word today, not just a curse word. It also legitimately meant somebody who was illegitimate, all puns intended. meaning that, you know, their parents were not married and they had no official stake or claim in the family legacy. So Alexander Hamilton's prospects were very low, and his mother died from illness when he was just a kid. He gets taken under the wing of a wealthy merchant and begins doing like the accounting work for him. So he does have a little background there. And eventually, this merchant helps fund this very bright young lad who is a voracious reader and basically, you know, self-taught and just an amazing mind. The merchant who had taken young Alexander under his wing will fund his schooling in America, in New York. And so Hamilton goes to America, and that's where his journey begins as a founding father. You know, and he eventually joins the American Revolution. Um, He'll make a great impression on George Washington, becoming the aide-de-camp. He'll participate in many of the battles of the American Revolution, including famously commanding some troops at Yorktown. And then he goes on and becomes a lawyer and a statesman in New York. Is there with right beside James Madison, his eventual rival. They were good working associates, helping to make the Annapolis and later the Constitutional Convention happen. And then, of course, he and Madison and John Jay, they were the writers of those Federalist Papers, defending the Constitution and ensuring its ratification. And then he gets appointed the Treasury Secretary. So this is Alexander Hamilton. He is a Federalist member in the ratification debates. The Federalists were the ones who supported the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists, they did not want the Constitution. Many of them only agreed to support it after there was a promise of the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. Remember that finally got added, those first 10 amendments in 1791. But, you know, once the Constitution was ratified and George Washington became our first president, there really was no more need of the Anti-Federalists. They had lost, basically. The Constitution was, you know, it passed. But there were still those that would call themselves the Federalists, and Hamilton is squarely in this group and becomes one of the leaders of this faction known as the Federalists. Now, this is before there are official political parties. The two-party system we have today is going to be a long way off, but it is under Washington's presidency that we'll see the beginning of this, and it happens because of the rivalry and the arguments that take place in his cabinet between Alexander Hamilton and his Federalist faction and the Secretary of State. Remember who the Secretary of State was? Thomas Jefferson. And his faction, also very important with Jefferson, is going to be Hamilton's old buddy turned rival, James Madison, who, remember, also during Washington's first term was instrumental in most of Washington's machinations. Madison was all up in this. So we'll see the beginning of the political parties kind of developed at this time. But back to Hamilton's financial plan, which is something that's going to divide everybody. He decides the best way to deal with all of this debt from the Revolutionary War was to have the national government assume or take over every state's debt. Say, what? Why would that be a good idea? How would the national government pay for it? Why would the national government want to take every state's debt? Why can't the states just pay it themselves? And what about those states that already have paid off their debt or mostly have paid it off? Should they be forced to subsidize or pay for other states who have more debt? So there's a lot of questions with this, but basically, Hamilton answers this by saying and arguing that if the national government assumes the state's debts, the responsibility of the national government will grow. It will be taken more seriously, and it will become easier for the national government to obtain credit. Now, think about what credit means. You've probably heard of this before, okay? If you want to get a loan from a bank today, right, you have to have good credit. Your credit score, right? Well, how do you get good credit? you have to make purchases and prove that you can pay off those purchases. Well, Hamilton is arguing here that the United States, in order to make itself more legitimate, in order to be able to obtain loans from like European banks, which is, let's be real, that's where the money's at. In order for the national government to be able to take loans and do the business that it needs to financially, it has to earn some good credits. And the only way to earn credit is to create a debt for itself. Hey, there's all this debt from the states. Take that on so that it can begin paying it off and get that good credit score. And that is a brilliant plan. It's also very contentious. Like I said, some states had already paid off their debt, and they're saying, heck no, we are not going to be at all responsible for paying off those other states. Like, for instance, Virginia had already mostly paid off its debt. Versus Massachusetts, who had reasonably, had a lot of fighting take place in their state. Their debt was huge, and they were nowhere near paying it off. So many of these southern states, like Virginia and the Carolinas, they say this wasn't fair. They say that this would basically be the southern states paying off the debt for the northern states. And you can start to see a split form here in the cabinet between Thomas Jefferson, who's from Virginia, and Alexander Hamilton, who've been from New York. And what eventually happens is Jefferson hosts a famed, legendary, maybe it happened this way, maybe it didn't, but this is the story, dinner party, and invites Alexander Hamilton and his good friend James Madison. And the three men, they have dinner, they sit after their meal with cigars, whatever. And in these lounge chairs after dinner, they discuss what to do, and they basically broker a compromise. Remember, government's based on compromise. And the agreement was that the national government would assume the state's debts. In exchange, the national government, which they were debating at this time in Congress, where the national government would eventually find its permanent house, its permanent headquarters, its capital. So we'd assume the national debts, and in exchange, the southern states, what they would get out of this is that the national capital would be moved south, right next to the border of Virginia and Maryland, in what is today the District of Columbia, or Washington, D.C. So that is how the national capital got moved down there. And basically it was chosen as that site, not because, there was something really good right there. It was a swamp. That's why if you ever hear DC referred to mockingly as, clean up the swamp there, blah, blah, blah. It literally had been a swamp there on the Potomac River between Virginia and Maryland. The reason they move it there is it's coastal, but also it's right there on what we call the Mason-Dixie line. The Mason-Dixon line was the dividing line between kind of the South and the North. So it was seen as a compromise. The seat of power would be between the two. The next part of Hamilton's financial agreement would be that the Congress would pass a series of tariffs. This was meant to protect our new nascent American industry. If you'll recall, under our colonial mercantilist structure, England had set us up to be the producers of raw materials, which would be shipped in triangular trade or quadrilateral trade, or however you want to do it, across the Atlantic over to England. They would be made into finished products and then sold back to us. So that meant that we were set up not to, manufacture our own goods, but to import them, which definitely benefited southern states, who were big exporters of raw materials, like, eventually cotton. We haven't talked about Eli Whitney yet, but cotton, indigo, tobacco, and so on. Those raw materials were really what our economy was based on, and we didn't have a lot of manufacturing. Hamilton knew that this was a big oversight. To be an independent nation, we needed to up our manufacturing. Now, of course, coincidentally, who does this benefit? The North, right? And so that's what's going to happen. This tariff is going to basically make it more expensive to buy imported goods. It's going to make other countries less likely to import our goods. It's going to make trade on the whole harder and kind of force Americans to start producing their own things and buy our own American-made products. So when we pass tariffs, tariffs make it more expensive to trade. It makes trade harder. We're protecting our American businesses. This is called protectionist policies, protectionist. And that is something that Trump has been doing a lot of, actually, recently here. Now we're talking about 2020. But anyway, that's another part of Hamilton's financial plan, to protect American industry, to promote American-made, manufacturing. We would pass these tariffs that would benefit the North, who's going to become very dependent on manufacturing, and at the detriment to the South, who was based on agriculture and exportation of raw materials. By the way, that is Alexander Hamilton's portrait on the $10 bill. That's part of the initial Hamilton soundtrack, the $10 founding father without a father. Now you know where that line comes from. He's on the $10 bill along with other famous American presidents, even though Hamilton was never a president. In fact, funny story, the constitutional requirements to be president are that you must be 35 years of age or older, you must have been living in the United States the past 14 years, and that last little, one, you must have been born in the United States, a natural-born American citizen. Now, if you're like John McCain, if you were born on an American base to American service members, you're still an American-born citizen. There's some clauses there, but basically the founding fathers in Article 2 of the Constitution threw that last qualification of natural-born American in because of Alexander Hamilton, because many of them did not want Hamilton to become president. It's kind of thought that's why that particular addendum was thrown in, because it's very strange if you think about it. And I know I'm spending way too much time on this, but it's fascinating. Most of the founding fathers, if you think about like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, all these guys, they were born before the Constitution. They were born before the American Revolution. They were born before the French and Indian War, in fact. They were born as British citizens, British colonial citizens at any rate. So they were members of the British Empire. They were not born as United States citizens. And so the qualification that you must be born in America, that particularly was aimed at Hamilton, who was born where? In the West Indies, in the Caribbean. So anyway, that's all things to consider. There is Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator and the star of the Hamilton musical. Also, if you didn't know, you like that movie Moana? I do too. He was the main writer, and I think he also sings in one of the songs for it, of all the songs on Moana. Okay. So Hamilton's financial plan, the United States is going to assume all the state debt in order to accrue credits and be able to function. It's going to, because of this deal, made the national capital there in Washington, D.C. We're going to have tariffs in order to protect and promote American manufacturing. And oh yeah, we need to have a tax in order to pay for all the debt, in order to generate revenue, money. We must have some tax on something. Well, they choose to specifically enumerate a tax on distilled liquors. And this becomes known as the whiskey tax because the most profitable, widespread, popular liquor at this time was whiskey. It was the easiest to make. And it was so widespread that, in fact, in most Western frontier communities in the United States at this time, whiskey was actually used as currency because it kept for so long. And so even though it's for it could be for lots of distilled liquors like rum and other things, it's mainly going to be on whiskey, and it's mainly going to be hurting poor farmers. Does this sound familiar? Shays Rebellion, remember? Well, it should, because this will actually lead to the later Whiskey Rebellion we'll talk about probably in the next lecture. But this excise tax on whiskey, it was a way to generate some money, and it was the first internal tax done by our new governments. Pretty unpopular. We don't like taxes. A lot of people were saying, Hamilton, what are you doing? This is just like what we left with the British. And Hamilton's saying, well, guys, you want to have a government, you want the government to work and be able to do stuff, government's got to have money. and he's the Treasury Secretary. So history is all about looking at different perspectives, and I hope that in everything you do and every opinion that you give to somebody, I hope you guys take a thorough look at both sides to the story. That's always so important. You know, even if you think somebody's opinions, their ideas are stupid, okay, just take a moment to see things from their point of view. Okay, that's really, really important. And throughout American history, you know, we need to look at both sides. We need to put ourselves in the context of the times when these people lived, see their situation and why they made the choices that they did. Because yeah, some of the things they did were horrible. Some of the laws that have been passed in this nation were absolutely racist, nativist, sexist, terrible laws. But also we could see hopefully where they're coming from and why they did the things that they did. um, it gives you a more thorough look at arguments today, right? And there is that famous quote, I think should always be the back of our minds when we're looking at history and thinking about why we're studying it so thoroughly. Why are you required to have this class? You know, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. History isn't cyclical. It doesn't repeat itself exactly the same way. But if you have a more thorough understanding of the way things happened and why they did and these different perspectives, and you have your training to kind of look at things from both sides, you're going to be able to make better decisions moving forward. Anyway, off my soapbox now. All right. And then the most important part of Hamilton's financial plan, the creation of a national bank. Now, of course, like everything Hamilton's talking about, he's basing it off of the British system. Britain had a national bank. This new Bank of the United States, it will eventually be passed. Like I said, that backdoor deal between Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton, it moved the national capital down to DC, between Virginia and Maryland. Um, and in exchange, Madison and Jefferson, they're going to get the votes in Congress required to pass all the rest of this, including a national bank. The first bank of the United States, it's going to be chartered for about 20 years. When it comes up for rechartering, there's going to be a huge bank war. We'll talk more about the bank wars and stuff when we get to like Jackson. But basically, the Bank of the United States, there's a lot of people very suspicious of it because, I mean, obviously today, we know you need a bank. You need a bank to collect the taxes. You need the bank to hold the revenue. You need the bank to give out loans. You need the bank to issue currency, right? Currency at this time is a very complicated situation that was not yet dealt with. You need a bank for all those things, but at the same time, who is going to be in control of the bank? I mean, presumably the federal government, George Washington, the president, and specifically Alexander Hamilton, his Treasury Secretary, would oversee the bank. But at the same time, when you actually looked at it, it was going to be private investors who were going to control like 3/4 of the bank. And I mean, you're basically giving governmental power and money and influence over to these private investors who are all from, like, you know, the financial cities of the North. So Southerners, and in particularly Jefferson and Madison, were very suspicious of this national bank and fought against it tooth and nail until they brokered that agreement we talked about. Those who believed that the Constitution gave the government the right to create a national bank, those were called the loose constructionists, and that would be like Hamilton, the Federalists. They believed that under the loose construction theory of the constitutional interpretation, like how we look at the Constitution, what it means, that just because the Constitution doesn't specifically say something, it doesn't mean it's not implied. That's why it's loose. And they specifically, Hamilton referred to like how does the government have the authority to make the bank? Well, he said, look at Article 1, which deals with Congress. Congress is going to create this bank. And look at this clause, the necessary and proper clause, sometimes referred to as the elastic clause. Remember that one? Congress shall have all powers necessary and proper to maintain the functioning of the government, or something of those lines. Well, necessary and proper, if the government under the Constitution, if Congress has the authority to tax the people and generate revenue, how is it supposed to do that unless there is a bank? So Hamilton argues that this fits in This is an implied power, in other words. So Jefferson, and that's T.J. Thomas Jefferson, Madison, and his guys, who are going to eventually form their own faction that will be known as the Democratic Republicans, in opposition to the Federalists under guys like Hamilton. Jefferson argues the more strict constructionist view of constitutional interpretation, which is like it sounds. Like, if it don't say it in the Constitution, you can't do it. Okay, so that's where Jefferson is saying, hey, the Constitution doesn't mention anything about banking, so the federal government cannot make a bank. That is the strict constructionist view. And we're still having this argument today. This is what Supreme Court justices do. They're supposed to interpret the will of the Constitution. Well, what does it mean? Are there implied powers, or do you just read the letter of the law? You could look at this also in biblical interpretation. You know, fundamentalists believe in a strict interpretation of the Bible. Other more progressive denominations, they look at it more as implied, more loose constructionist views. So this is what's going on. Here's a little political cartoon. We need one strong national bank. It's like Hamilton. See, there's his name. No, we need small state banks. There's Jefferson. And then here's, say, does anybody have change for a Franklin? There's 100. So pointing out that how are you going to get change or currency or anything else unless you have a bank? So in opposition to this financial plan, Jefferson and Madison are going to create their own faction. Like I said, the Democratic Republican Party, or the Jeffersonians, sometimes they're called. And originally, ironically, they were actually just called the Republicans, the word republic. But this is not, I repeat, this is not the Republican Party like we have today, okay? That was different. That will be formed much, much later in like the mid 1800s in opposition to slavery and some other nativist trends and other things. This Democratic Republican Party, they're in opposition to the national bank. They're in opposition to the tariff. They're in opposition to the national government assuming the state's debts. So basically, they're in opposition to Hamilton's financial plan. That's what they rise up in opposition to. Some of them tended to be like those that had earlier during the ratification debate over the Constitution been with the anti-federalists, guys like Patrick Henry and whatnot. So this is the beginning of what we call the first political party system. It's going to be Jefferson and Madison's Democratic Republicans versus like Hamilton and others Federalists. Now, because of all this infighting between these new groups and factions within Washington's own cabinet, here in 1792, Washington is like ready to retire. Remember, he didn't even really want to do this to begin with. He wanted to be back on his plantation in Virginia at Mount Vernon. He wants to be done. And he'd originally, basically set out to just have one term and then step down. He had his right-hand man, he's got a lot of right-hand men, right? James Madison actually draft for him a farewell address in 1792. But because of this infighting in his own cabinet between Hamilton and Jefferson, Washington just can't step down. And so he will basically be pushed by all of these different advisors. Everybody said, Washington, don't leave us right now. It's funny because like Hamilton was begging Washington not to leave because he didn't want Jefferson to get more authority. And same thing, Jefferson didn't want Washington to leave because he didn't want Hamilton to take over. And so these guys, they basically kind of put Washington in a position where he's forced to run again for a second term. And of course, he wins just as easily. He did not want to be there. In his second inaugural address to the nation upon his reelection in 1793, Washington basically gives a speech that was, not even kidding, like one paragraph long. Like he didn't want to be there, but he's doing it because he knows he's keeping this new nation together at a time when it is very extremely fragile. And we will talk about that fragility next time on Dragon Ball Z. Next time in our lecture, we'll get into the tenuous situation with foreign policy, and I'll talk a little bit more about this new forming first political system. Thank you guys for your attention, and I'll talk to you later.